Welcome to Neural Nexus Podcast, where we explore the hottest topics shaping the world. Let's dive in.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. You're here because you want to really get into some interesting topics and cut through all the noise and figure out what's really going on. And we try to do it efficiently, right?
That's what we aim for. We want to make sure that your time is well spent.
Absolutely. So today we are focusing on some recent events in U.S. politics. And we've got some great material from the Associated Press and Fox News to unpack.
Yeah, you found some really interesting stuff. I mean, it's kind of all over the place. We've got some local stuff going on. We've got some stuff happening in Washington. And then we even have a little bit of a history lesson.
Right, exactly. So let's dive in and let's start with this idea of how elected officials are actually connecting with the people that they represent. That it's their job to represent the people. And we found these two stories about Republican town halls that happened just a day apart, and they were so different from each other. I mean, it was just striking to me.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that you notice is just the difference in atmosphere.
Right. The AP reported on these two town halls. One was in North Carolina, the other was in Wyoming, and the one in Asheville, North Carolina, with Representative Chuck Edwards. That was intense.
It sounded pretty intense.
Yeah, they said there were about 300 people inside the town hall, but there were like 1,000 protesters outside.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is in Buncombe County, and the AP pointed out that in the last election, Trump only got about 37% of the vote there. So it's not like a super strong Republican area.
Right, it's more of a kind of a purple area.
Exactly. And the AP talked about this one guy named Jay Carey, who was there, and he's a Democrat and a retired military veteran, and he was really upset. He had some flooding, his property was damaged during a hurricane, and he was yelling at Representative Edwards saying that he wasn't doing his job.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they even had to escort him out because he was using really strong language.
So people are really fired up.
Yeah, you can just feel the frustration there.
Yeah.
And then you compare that to the town hall that Representative Harriet Hageman had in Wyoming. It was in Evanston, and it was a much quieter scene,
Yeah, what was the difference there?
Well, they said there were only about 250 people there, and it sounded like most of them were Republicans asking questions.
Okay, so very different.
Yeah, and this was in Uintah County, where Trump got something like 80% of the vote.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and statewide in Wyoming, he got almost 72%. So it's a very different political landscape.
Very different, yeah. So you've got these two, representatives. One's facing this huge, almost angry mob. And then the other one is having this kind of more traditional town hall.
Right. And even in Wyoming, they were bringing up some really interesting issues. One woman, Joy Walton, she's 76 years old, and she was asking about Elon Musk's role in the executive branch.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Trump has given Musk a lot of responsibility to try and streamline the government, and she was kind of confused about what exactly Musk's role was.
It is kind of a confusing situation.
Right. And Representative Hageman explained that Musk is considered a special government employee. He has top secret security clearance. And she praised his work focusing on these foreign aid contracts at USSO, the United States Agency for International Development.
Right.
And she even called USA a monstrosity and waste of money.
So that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah, it gives you a sense of how some Republicans view government spending.
Definitely.
But not everyone in Wyoming agreed with that perspective. The AP mentioned this guy, Carl Allred, who's a Republican and a former Wyoming Secretary of State, and he was all for cutting wasteful spending. But he made the point that if you're going to make serious cuts, you have to include the defense budget, too.
Well, that's interesting because that's always a sensitive topic.
Right. And even Hageman herself disagreed with Musk on one thing, cutting 10,000 Postal Service workers. She was concerned about how that would affect a state like Wyoming, where the population is small and spread out, and they really rely on the Postal Service.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, in a rural area like that, the post office is really essential.
Exactly. So what do we take away from these two town halls? I think it just really shows you how different the political climate is in different parts of the country,
Yeah.
even within the same party.
Yeah, you've got these different regions, different demographics, and they have different concerns, different priorities.
Right. And it's a real challenge for these elected officials to try and represent everyone and address all of these different needs.
Definitely. And I think, the anger that we saw in North Carolina, it just speaks volumes about the division and the frustration that exists in some parts of the country. And then in Wyoming, it was less confrontational, but you could still sense that there's this anxiety and there's this real desire for change.
Okay, so let's move on from those town halls and we'll go to Washington, D.C., where things are also getting pretty heated.
Always someone going on there.
Right. Fox News reported on this really interesting development. Republican Representative Brandon Gill from Texas filed impeachment articles against a federal judge. Yeah, Judge James Boasberg. And this is where things get complicated. The background is that Judge Boasberg issued an order to temporarily halt the Trump administration's deportation flights. And these flights were happening under the Alien Enemies Act, which is a really old law. It goes back to 1798.
1798. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, that was a time when the U.S. was actually at war with France.
Right.
So some people are saying that this law isn't really relevant anymore.
Right. It was meant for a very different time.
Exactly. And Representative Gill was furious. He basically said that Judge Boasberg is a rogue activist judge who is going way beyond his authority and that he's blocking President Trump from doing his job, which is to keep the country safe.
So what specifically did the judge do?
Well, it seems like the main issue was that Judge Boasberg ordered the president to turn around planes that were in the air. These planes were carrying people who were associated with Tren de Aragua, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Gill is saying that this put national security at risk and that the judge was abusing his power.
Okay, so it sounds like a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, but to be fair to Judge Boasberg, there were some human rights groups who were really concerned about these deportation flights. Their argument was that there might be Venezuelan nationals on those planes who have legitimate asylum claims. You know, people who are fleeing a dangerous situation, and they're worried that these people would get deported even if they had nothing to do with this terrorist organization.
Right. That's valid concern.
Yeah, and Judge Boasberg actually issued a verbal restraining order on a Saturday night to try and stop those flights.
Oh, so it was an emergency order.
Yeah, and of course, President Trump responded immediately on Truth Social. He called Judge Boasberg a radical left lunatic of a judge and said that he should be impeached for interfering with the voters' will on illegal immigration.
Oh, boy.
And then to make things even more interesting, the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, shared a video that seemed to show U.S. deportees arriving in El Salvador, and they were getting their heads shaved at a prison.
Oh, wow. So this is getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, it's definitely a very visual and emotional issue. And the Trump administration is saying that 2 of the planes had already taken off before Judge Boasberg issued his written order, so they couldn't turn them around.
Right.
And they're also saying that a 3rd plane wasn't even carrying any Alien Enemies Act deportees.
Okay, so it's kind of a he said, she said situation.
Right. But then Judge Boasberg asked this question during a court hearing. He said, how can it be that my judicial authority doesn't apply to a plane that's in international airspace?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right. I mean, where does one country's laws end and another country's laws begin?
Exactly.
So this is a really big clash between the judicial and executive branches.
And AP mentioned that this isn't the only case like this.
Yeah, they said that Representatives Crane Van Orden and Clyde, they've all talked about impeaching another federal judge, Judge Paul Engelmayer. He blocked some of the Department of Government Efficiency's efforts.
So it seems like this could be a trend.
Right. Some members of the House are willing to use impeachment as a tool to challenge judges who they think are getting in the way of the administration's policies.
And that raises some serious questions about the separation of powers.
Absolutely. And what does it mean for the authority of these lower-level federal judges? I mean, could this even end up going to the Supreme Court?
It's definitely possible. I mean, this isn't just about these specific deportation flights or this one judge. This is about the fundamental principles of our government. You know, the checks and balances that are supposed to keep any one branch from becoming too powerful.
Right. And if impeachment becomes a common tactic, it could really undermine the independence of the judiciary.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's shift gears one more time and talk about something completely different. We're going to go back in time now.
Time travel.
Sort of. On Monday, March 17th, President Trump announced that his administration is going to release a whole bunch of files related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's something like 80,000 files.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, and he said they're going to be released without any redactions. He made a campaign promise to do this,
Right.
but the AP pointed out that we don't actually know how many of these files are new. You know, there have been millions of pages released over the years.
I was going to say, hasn't a lot of this stuff already been released?
Right. It's a huge collection of documents. But even so, I mean, this announcement is a big deal for people who are interested in this event. You know, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963.
Right.
And Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. And then 2 days later, Jack Ruby shot and killed Oswald.
Yeah. It's such a strange story.
Right. And then the Warren Commission concluded in 1964 that Oswald had acted alone, But a lot of people don't believe that.
Right. There are all sorts of conspiracy theories.
Exactly. So back in the early 1990s, Congress passed a law that said all of these JFK files had to be gathered up and kept at the National Archives, and they were supposed to be released to the public by 2017. But presidents could exempt certain documents. And President Trump did release a bunch of files during his first term, but he kept some of them secret. He said it was for national security reasons.
Okay.
But we're talking about millions of pages here. They said that over 6 million pages have been released.
6 million.
Yeah, but researchers estimated that there were still about 3,000 files that hadn't been seen. And then on top of that, the FBI just recently found about 2,400 more records.
So there's always something new coming out.
Yeah, and then there are about 500 documents that weren't even covered by that 2017 law, things like tax returns and stuff.
Okay.
But even from the files that have been released, we've learned some interesting things.
Like what?
Well, the AP talked about how we've gotten more information about what the intelligence services were doing back then. Like there are these CIA cables and memos that show Lee Harvey Oswald visiting the Soviet and Cuban embassies in Mexico City just a few weeks before the assassination.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we know that Oswald had defected to the Soviet Union before he came back to the U.S. And in these files, there's information about Oswald calling the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. He was trying to get a visa to go back to the Soviet Union. He also went to the Cuban embassy, probably because he thought that might be a way to get to the USSR.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then he came back to the U.S. on October 3rd, 1963. And there's even a memo that says that U.S. intelligence intercepted a phone call where Oswald was talking to a KGB officer in Mexico City.
Oh, wow. So he was definitely in contact with the Soviets.
Yeah, and all this stuff just kind of gives you a sense of what the world was like back then. You know, the Cold War was really intense.
Right.
But even though all of these files are coming out, a lot of experts think that we're probably not going to find anything that completely changes our understanding of the assassination.
Right. It's not like there's going to be a smoking gun.
But the public is still fascinated by this event.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's such a major historical moment.
Right. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with those very different Republican town halls, which show you how divided the country is. And then we talked about the clash between the executive and judicial branches over immigration. And then we went back in time to the JFK assassination.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
It has. So what are the big takeaways here?
Well, I think one thing is that there's just a lot of tension in American politics right now. You know, you've got these divisions between rural and urban areas, between Republicans and Democrats, between the different branches of government.
Right. And I think the impeachment stuff is really worrying. I mean, it's supposed to be this really serious process, but if it starts being used for political reasons, it could really damage our democracy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then with the JFK files, I mean, it's just a reminder that history is complicated and there are always more secrets to uncover.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how these events all kind of connect. You know, they all reflect the different challenges that America is facing right now. Right. So we'll leave you with this question. How do these seemingly separate stories, the town hall reactions, the impeachment threats, and the release of these historical documents, how do they all fit together? What do they tell us about the state of American politics and where we might be headed?
Yeah, that's a good question for everyone to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, keep thinking critically.
And keep learning.